Jake Morrison floated in the zero-gravity maintenance shaft of the mining station Kepler-7, his tools drifting around him like metal fish in a dark ocean. The routine inspection had been going smoothly until the proximity alarm started screaming through the station's corridors. He pushed himself toward the nearest viewport and peered into the black void of space. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 massive ships hung in the darkness beyond the asteroid field. They were unlike anything in human design, all sharp, angles and organic curves that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. The hulls were dark purple, almost black, with veins of sickly green light running along their surfaces like infected wounds. Jake had never seen ships like these before, but he knew what they had to be. The Veltar Empire had found them. The mining station shuddered as the first energy blasts struck its outer hull. Jake grabbed his comm unit and tried to reach his crew. Aboard the stellar drift, but only static answered him. Either the aliens were jamming communications, or his ship was already gone. He pushed himself through the maintenance tunnels toward the emergency pods, but the station was dying around him faster than he could move. Sections of the outer hull began venting atmosphere into space, creating violent winds that pulled debris and unfortunate workers into the void. Jake fought against the rushing air, his magnetic boots struggling to find purchase on the metal surfaces. He could hear the screams of other miners echoing through the corridors, but there was nothing he could do for them now. The emergency pod bay was in chaos when Jake finally reached it. Panicked civilians fought over the few remaining escape pods, while station security tried to maintain order. Jake counted the pods and the people. There were not enough to go around. The station commander was shouting orders that no one could hear over the noise of tearing metal and rushing air. Jake made his decision quickly. He was a military veteran who had served in the Outer Rim conflicts. These were civilian miners and researchers who had never seen combat. He stepped back from the pod bay and sealed the emergency door behind him. Through the reinforced window, he watched the last pods launch into space, carrying the survivors toward the slim hope of rescue. The station's artificial gravity failed completely as Jake made his way back through the dying corridors. Emergency. Lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, while debris floated through the air like deadly snow. He could feel the station's structure groaning around him as the alien ships continued their methodical destruction. Jake reached the communication center and tried one last time to send a distress signal to Earth. The equipment was damaged but still partially functional. He managed to transmit the station's location and a brief description of the attacking ships before the power finally failed completely. Whether anyone would receive the message was now out of his hands. The boarding pods hit the station's hull, like metallic meteors, their drill tips punching through the reinforced plating as if it were paper. Jake could hear them cutting through the inner bulkheads, getting closer with each passing minute. He found an emergency kit and checked its contents: a basic laser cutter, some emergency rations, and a small medical kit. Not much to defend himself with, but he had survived on less during his military service. The first Veltar soldiers burst through the bulkhead near the command center like nightmares given form. They were tall and reptilian, covered in natural armor plates that gleamed like polished obsidian. Their faces were elongated with rows of sharp teeth and eyes that glowed with predatory intelligence. Each one carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. Jake had heard descriptions of the Veltar from military briefings, but seeing them in person was different. They moved with the fluid grace of natural predators, every step calculated and efficient. Their leader was even larger than the others, with elaborate markings carved into her armor and bioluminescent patterns that pulsed along her neck and arms. The aliens methodically searched the station, their sensors sweeping every corner for survivors. Jake hid in a maintenance closet, controlling his breathing and trying to slow his heartbeat. He knew it was only a matter of time before they found him, but every minute he stayed free was another minute for the escape pods to get farther away. When they finally detected him, Jake made no attempt to resist. The Veltar soldiers surrounded him with weapons raised, clearly expecting him to fight or beg for his life. Instead, he slowly raised his hands and stepped out of his hiding place. The alien leader studied him with obvious curiosity, her head tilted like a predator examining unfamiliar prey. They bound his hands with energy restraints that burned his wrists when he tried to test them. The leader spoke to him in accented but clear English, her voice like gravel grinding against metal. She told him that resistance was futile and that humanity would soon learn to serve the Veltar Empire. Jake said nothing in response, just met her gaze steadily until she looked away first. The transport ship that carried Jake to the main fleet was cramped and dark, designed for cargo rather than passengers. He was thrown into a holding cell with barely enough room to stand upright. Through a small porthole, he could see the burning remains of Kepler-7 growing smaller in the distance. How many good people had died today because humanity was not ready for war with a species like this? Jake used the time during transport to study his captors and their ship. The Veltar were efficient, but not particularly careful about security around what they considered a helpless prisoner. He memorized the patrol routes of the guards and the locations of emergency equipment. Old military habits were hard to break, and Jake had learned long ago that information was often more valuable than weapons. The main fleet was even more impressive and terrifying than he had imagined. Dozens of warships hung in formation around a massive command vessel that could have housed a small city. The alien fleet represented military power on a scale that could crush human civilization if it reached Earth. Jake watched through his cell's porthole as smaller ships moved between the larger vessels like schools of predatory fish. When the transport docked with the command ship, Jake was hauled through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate prisoners. The walls were covered with trophies from conquered species, and the lighting cast ominous shadows that made everything look more threatening. Veltar crew members watched him pass with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. His final destination was a detention block deep within the ship's bowels. The cell they threw him into was bare except for a metal bench and a waste disposal unit. The walls were smooth and featureless, probably designed to prevent prisoners from finding anything they could use as a weapon or tool for escape. Jake sat on the bench and began to wait. He had no illusions about his situation or his chances of survival. The Veltar were clearly preparing for war against humanity, and they would want information from him about human defenses and capabilities. He would have to be very careful about what he told them and what he kept hidden. The fate of his species might depend on how well he could play the game that was about to begin. The cell door opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and Commander Zixandra stepped inside like death-wearing armor. She was even more imposing up close, her reptilian features sharp and predatory in the dim lighting. The bioluminescent markings on her neck pulsed in slow rhythms that Jake suspected indicated her emotional state. Right now they glowed with the steady confidence of a predator approaching helpless prey. Two smaller Veltar soldiers flanked the doorway, but remained outside. Zixandra wanted this conversation to be private, which told Jake something important about her personality and methods. She was the kind of leader who preferred personal intimidation over crude physical torture. That might be useful information later. Jake remained seated on the metal bench, his posture relaxed but alert. He had learned during his military service that showing fear to bullies only encouraged them, while false bravado usually backfired. The best approach was calm professionalism, treating the situation like any other military briefing. It tended to confuse people who expected their prisoners to be either terrified or defiant. Zixandra activated a holographic projector that filled the air between them with images of destroyed worlds. The first planet looked like it had once been beautiful, with blue oceans and green continents. Now it was a charred wasteland where nothing moved except the wind across empty deserts. The alien commander's voice was like steel scraping against stone as she began to speak. She told Jake about the conquest of the Altarian Republic, a peaceful species that had tried to negotiate rather than fight. The Veltar had pretended to consider their diplomatic offers while positioning their fleets for maximum devastation. When the attack came, it was swift and merciless. Entire cities had been reduced to ash in minutes, and the survivors were herded into labor camps where they lived only as long as they remained useful. The holographic display shifted to show the fall of the Kepler Union, a federation of mining, worlds not unlike the human colonies in the Outer Rim. These people had actually managed to put up significant resistance, using guerrilla tactics and hidden bases to prolong the war for several years. Zixandra seemed almost respectful when she described their fighting spirit, but the respect did not extend to mercy. The final images showed the last Kepler strongholds burning, while Veltar ships harvested the mineral wealth that had made these worlds valuable. Jake watched the horrific display without changing expression. He had seen similar atrocities during his own military service, when human colonies had been attacked by raiders and pirates. The scale was different, but the cruelty was familiar. He filed away every detail of the alien tactics and technology for later analysis, treating the presentation like an intelligence briefing rather than a terror campaign. Zixandra seemed frustrated by his lack of reaction. She changed the holographic display to show closer images of individual suffering. Alien children separated from their parents, elderly beings worked to death in mining operations, entire families executed for minor acts of defiance. Her voice took on a more personal tone as she described the creative ways that Veltar commanders punished resistance. The alien commander moved closer to Jake, her claws clicking against the metal floor with each step. She told him about the interrogation techniques that the Veltar had perfected over centuries of conquest. Some species broke quickly under physical torture, while others required more psychological pressure. A few stubborn races needed to watch their loved ones suffer before they would cooperate. She wondered aloud which category humans would fall into. Jake continued to listen without visible reaction, though internally he was cataloging everything she revealed about Veltar methods and psychology. The commander was clearly intelligent and experienced, but she was also arrogant in the way that many successful predators became. She expected him to break down and beg for mercy, or perhaps try to bargain for better treatment. When he did neither, her bioluminescent markings began to pulse faster, with what might have been annoyance. The holographic display changed again to show what Zixandra claimed were the future plans for Earth. Massive Veltar fleets would emerge from hyperspace around the major human worlds simultaneously, preventing any coordinated defense. The initial bombardment would target military installations and government centers, decapitating human leadership before organized resistance could form. Civilian populations would be sorted into useful and expendable categories based on their skills and genetic fitness. She described how human cities would be rebuilt as processing centers for whatever resources the Veltar found valuable on each world. The majority of the population would become industrial slaves, working in conditions that would kill most of them within a few years. A small breeding population would be maintained to ensure a steady supply of replacement workers. Human culture, language, and history would be systematically erased to prevent future rebellion. Jake absorbed these details with the same professional detachment he had shown throughout the presentation. Part of his mind was already working on ways to warn Earth about what was coming, while another part analyzed the alien plans for weaknesses and potential countermeasures. The Veltar strategy was thorough and had clearly worked against other species, but it made certain assumptions about human psychology and capabilities that might not be accurate. Zixandra finally shut off the holographic projector and loomed over Jake with her full height and presence. Her voice dropped to a menacing whisper as she delivered what was clearly meant to be her closing argument. She told him that resistance was not just futile, but actively harmful to his species. The more humans fought, the more brutal their eventual subjugation would become. If he cooperated now by providing information about human defenses and capabilities, she might be able to convince her superiors to treat Earth more leniently. The alien commander's bioluminescent markings were now pulsing, rapidly with what Jake interpreted as anticipation. This was the moment she expected him to crack, when the full weight of his species' situation would finally break through whatever psychological defenses he had managed to maintain. She waited for him to speak, her predatory eyes fixed on his, face like a hunter watching wounded prey. Jake looked up at her with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout her entire presentation. His voice was quiet and steady when he finally spoke, carrying neither fear nor defiance, but something that was somehow more unsettling than either emotion would have been. He told her that she was mistaken about who should be afraid in this situation. The words seemed to hit Zixandra like a physical blow. Her confident posture wavered for just a moment, and her bioluminescent markings flickered with what might have been confusion or uncertainty. She had clearly expected many possible responses from her human prisoner, but this calm reversal had not been among them. She recovered quickly, but Jake had seen that moment of doubt, and he knew she had seen it too. Zixandra's voice regained its menacing tone as she demanded to know what he meant by his strange response. She reminded him of his helpless position, trapped aboard her ship with no weapons, no allies, and no hope of rescue. His entire species was about to face extinction or slavery, and he had the audacity to suggest that she should be afraid of him. The idea was so absurd that it bordered on madness. Jake remained seated and continued to meet her gaze steadily. His next words were spoken in the same quiet tone, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child who had missed an important lesson. He told her that she had made a fundamental error in her assessment of humanity, and that error was going to cost her and her species more than they could possibly imagine. The alien commander's markings were now pulsing in chaotic patterns that suggested genuine agitation. She took a step back from Jake, though she probably did not realize she was doing it. Something in his tone and manner had reached past her predatory confidence and touched a deeper instinct that warned of danger. For the first time since entering the cell, Zixandra was no longer entirely certain that she was the one in control of this conversation. Jake began to speak in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather or comment on ship maintenance schedules. He told Zixandra that humans were unusual among the species she had conquered because they were what biologists called persistence predators. Most creatures in the universe were either hunters or prey, but humans had evolved as something different and more dangerous than either category alone. The alien commander listened with growing unease as Jake explained how early humans had hunted, animals much larger and stronger than themselves. They did not rely on speed or strength or natural weapons like claws and fangs. Instead, they used their greatest evolutionary advantage, which was the ability to never give up. Human hunters would wound a mammoth or deer and then follow it for days or even weeks, never letting it rest, never letting it heal, until the prey finally collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. Zixandra's bioluminescent markings were pulsing in irregular patterns now, suggesting confusion and growing alarm. She had studied dozens of species before their conquest, and none of them had evolved this particular combination of intelligence and relentless determination. Most predators killed quickly or gave up and moved on to easier prey. Most prey animals focused on escape and hiding rather than prolonged resistance. Jake continued his explanation with the same matter-of-fact delivery that was somehow more chilling than any dramatic threat could have been. He told her that this hunting strategy had shaped every aspect of human psychology and culture. When humans encountered a problem they could not solve immediately, their instinct was not to flee or submit, but to keep trying until they found a solution or died in the attempt. The alien commander interrupted to point out that many species were capable of determination and persistence in the face of adversity. The Kepler Union had fought the Veltar for years before finally being crushed, and the Altarians had maintained their resistance movements even after their government surrendered. What made humans think they were special compared to all the other species that had eventually fallen to superior Veltar technology and organization. Jake nodded, as if she had made a reasonable point, which somehow made his response even more disturbing than if he had dismissed her argument. He told her that she was correct about other species showing courage and determination, but she was missing the crucial difference. Those other species fought because they were not afraid, or because they were too afraid to think clearly. Humans fought because fear made them more dangerous, not less. He began to describe human history in the same calm, educational tone. He talked about the siege of a city called Leningrad, where people had eaten wallpaper paste and boiled leather rather than surrender to an enemy army. The siege had lasted nearly 3 years, and by the end, the survivors were walking skeletons. But they had never stopped fighting. The enemy had eventually given up and retreated, unable to understand how a population facing starvation could maintain such absolute resistance. Zixandra found herself leaning forward despite her growing unease, drawn into Jake's quiet recitation of human conflicts that seemed to defy all logical military strategy. He told her about Japanese pilots who had turned their aircraft into guided missiles, accepting certain death in exchange for the chance to damage enemy ships. He described resistance fighters who had smiled while being tortured because they knew their sacrifice would inspire others to continue the fight. The most disturbing part of Jake's presentation was not the stories themselves, but the way he told them. He showed no pride or boastfulness, no attempt to glorify or romanticize human warfare. He simply described these events as natural phenomena, like explaining how gravity worked or why water boiled at certain temperatures. To him, human behavior, under extreme stress, was as predictable and inevitable as any other scientific principle. Jake explained that humans had a saying that other species might find contradictory. They said that if you wanted peace, you had to prepare for war. This was not because humans enjoyed violence, but because they understood that some things were worth dying for, and potential enemies needed to know that fact. Peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of adequate deterrence against those who would destroy what you loved. Zixandra realized that she was no longer standing in the dominant position she had assumed when entering the cell. Somehow, without moving from his seat or raising his voice, Jake had shifted the entire dynamic of their conversation. She was now the one listening intently, while he calmly delivered information that challenged everything she thought she knew about human psychology and capabilities. The alien commander tried to regain control of the situation by reminding Jake that individual human courage meant nothing against the overwhelming technological superiority of the Veltar fleet. Her ships could destroy human worlds from orbit without ever coming within range of primitive human weapons. No amount of determination could overcome such a vast difference in military capability. Jake agreed that Veltar technology was indeed superior to current human weapons, but he suggested that she was making another dangerous assumption. She seemed to believe that the goal of human resistance would be to meet the Veltar fleet in open battle and somehow achieve victory through conventional military means. That was not how persistence predators operated when facing superior opposition. He told her about human conflicts where vastly outnumbered forces had defeated seemingly invincible enemies through unconventional tactics and pure stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He described how small groups of fighters had tied down entire armies for years, making occupation so costly and painful that the invaders eventually withdrew despite their military superiority. The key was not winning individual battles, but making the war too expensive for the enemy to continue. Zixandra's markings were now flashing in rapid, chaotic patterns that she was unable to control. Some deep instinct was warning her that she had wandered into dangerous territory, like a predator who had cornered what it thought was helpless prey, only to discover that it had trapped itself in a cave with something much more dangerous. She wanted to leave the cell and return to the familiar comfort of her command center, but she could not show weakness in front of a human prisoner. Jake seemed to notice her growing agitation, and his expression showed something that might have been sympathy. He told her that he understood her confusion because the Veltar had evolved as apex predators who dominated through superior strength and technology. That was an excellent strategy for most situations, but it created blind spots when dealing with species that had evolved different survival mechanisms. He explained that humans had learned to be afraid of the right things while remaining functional, enough to take effective action. Fear was not a weakness to be overcome, but information to be processed and used. A human who felt no fear was either insane or too inexperienced to understand the dangers around them. A human who was paralyzed by fear was equally useless. The dangerous humans were the ones who felt fear and continued to think clearly despite it. Zixandra found herself studying Jake's hands and posture with growing unease. Now that she was looking for it, she could see signs of the controlled fear he was describing. His breathing was slightly elevated and his muscles showed subtle tension, indicating that he was indeed afraid of his current situation. But his hands were steady. His voice remained calm, and his eyes continued to track her movements with calculating intelligence. He was afraid and thinking clearly at the same time. The alien commander realized that everything Jake had told her was not boasting or psychological warfare, but clinical analysis delivered with scientific detachment. He was explaining human behavior the way a biologist might describe the hunting patterns of a dangerous predator species. The most terrifying part was that he clearly included himself in that description, and he seemed to have no illusions about what that meant for everyone involved in this conflict. Jake looked directly into Zixandra's glowing eyes and told her something that made her blood freeze in her veins. His capture had not been an accident or a result of superior Veltar tactics. He had allowed himself to be taken prisoner as part of a carefully planned operation that had been set in motion weeks before the attack on Kepler-7. The alien commander's bioluminescent markings went completely dark for a moment before blazing back to life in chaotic patterns of alarm and disbelief. She demanded to know what he meant, her voice losing its carefully controlled menace and taking on the sharp edge of genuine fear. No prey species had ever deliberately walked into Veltar hands, and the idea that humans might be capable of such calculated deception challenged everything she understood about the natural order. Jake explained that human intelligence networks had detected Veltar scouts in the Outer Rim systems months earlier. Rather than simply reinforcing their defenses and hoping for the best, human military planners had developed a more ambitious strategy. They needed detailed information about Veltar ship designs, weapons capabilities, and fleet organization. The only way to gather that intelligence was to get someone aboard the Veltar command vessel. Zixandra interrupted to point out that sacrificing one person for intelligence gathering was hardly unique among military species. Many races had used suicide missions and infiltration tactics against the Veltar forces. What made Jake think that human intelligence would be any more effective than the efforts of species that had already been conquered and enslaved? Jake's response was delivered in the same calm tone that had characterized all of his explanations, but now it carried an undertone of something that made Zixandra's predatory instincts scream warnings. He told her that she was correct about other species attempting similar operations, but they had all made the same fundamental error. They had sent their best soldiers and spies, people who were trained to survive and escape after completing their missions. The alien commander felt a growing sense of dread as Jake continued his explanation. He told her that humans had chosen a different approach because they understood something about persistence predation that other species missed. Sometimes the most effective weapon was not the one that survived the mission, but the one that was designed from the beginning to be sacrificed for maximum effect. Jake had volunteered for this operation knowing that he would almost certainly die aboard the Veltar ship. His crew aboard the Stellar Drift had not been killed when their vessel was destroyed. They had evacuated to hidden emergency pods hours before the attack, taking with them detailed scans of the Veltar fleet formation and preliminary intelligence about alien technology and tactics. The mining charges that Jake's team had been placing around the asteroid field were not intended for mineral extraction. They had been carefully positioned to create a devastating trap for any fleet that entered, the system with aggressive intentions. Every moment that Zixandra had spent interrogating her human prisoner, those charges had been counting down toward a synchronized detonation that would turn the entire asteroid field into a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. Zixandra's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of what Jake was telling her. If the human was lying, it was an elaborate deception designed to create panic and confusion. If he was telling the truth, then her entire fleet was sitting in the middle of a carefully prepared killing ground while she played psychological games with what she had thought was a helpless prisoner. Jake seemed to read her thoughts and nodded sympathetically. He told her that he understood her dilemma because it illustrated the central problem that the Veltar Empire faced when dealing with persistence predators. When facing conventional prey species, superior firepower and intimidation were usually sufficient to achieve victory, but humans had evolved to be suspicious of situations that seemed too easy or enemies that appeared too confident. The asteroid field around Kepler-7 had been selected for this trap because it provided perfect cover for the mining charges while offering multiple escape routes for human forces. The Veltar fleet had positioned itself exactly where human tacticians had hoped it would, drawn by the apparent vulnerability of the mining station and the promise of easy conquest. Zixandra activated her personal communicator and tried to contact her fleet command center, but Jake informed her that the charges would also disrupt Veltar communication systems when they detonated. The electromagnetic pulse from the explosions would blind alien sensors and prevent coordinated response while human attack squadrons moved into position for the real battle. The alien commander realized that every detail of Jake's interrogation had served multiple purposes in the human plan. While she had been trying to break his spirit and extract information, he had been studying Veltar psychology, ship layouts, and security procedures. Every minute of conversation had provided him with intelligence that would eventually find its way back to human military planners. Jake told Zixandra that human military doctrine had learned important lessons from studying how other species had failed against the Veltar Empire. Most races had either tried to match Veltar firepower directly or had relied on desperate last-minute improvisations when their conventional forces proved inadequate. Humans had chosen a different path based on their understanding of persistence predation principles. Rather than waiting for the Veltar to choose the time and place of battle, humans had created conditions that would force the conflict to occur, on terms that favored human capabilities. The asteroid field negated much of the Veltar advantage in long-range firepower while providing cover for smaller, more maneuverable human ships. The communication disruption would prevent the kind of coordinated fleet actions that had crushed other species. Most importantly, Jake explained, the human battle plan had been designed by people who understood that losing individual engagements was acceptable as long as the overall war remained winnable. Human commanders were prepared to sacrifice entire fleets, if necessary, to inflict disproportionate damage on Veltar forces and demonstrate that conquering humanity would be far more costly than previous campaigns. Zixandra felt the ship shudder around them as the first mining charges began to detonate in carefully timed sequences. The emergency lighting activated as main power fluctuated, and she could hear the distinctive sound of hull plating being stressed beyond its design limits. Her worst fears were being confirmed as the human's trap finally revealed its true scope and devastating effectiveness. Jake remained seated throughout the chaos, his expression showing neither satisfaction nor regret. He told Zixandra that the hardest part of his mission had been convincing his superiors to let him volunteer for what was essentially a suicide operation. Human military culture traditionally emphasized bringing everyone home safely, but persistence. Predation sometimes required individual sacrifice for the survival of the group. The alien commander's training finally overcame her shock and confusion as she realized that her ship and fleet were under attack. She started toward the cell door, intending to reach her command center and coordinate whatever response might still be possible. But Jake's next words stopped her in her tracks like a physical barrier. He told her that the mining charges were only the first phase of the human attack plan. While her fleet was dealing with the chaos and damage from the explosions, human attack squadrons led by Admiral Karen White were already moving into position for the main assault. The Stellar Drift's crew had spent weeks mapping every approach, route, and defensive weakness in the asteroid field. Jake's voice remained calm even as the ship shook around them from repeated impacts and explosions. He explained that Admiral White had earned her reputation fighting pirates and raiders in the Outer Rim, where conventional tactics were less important than creative adaptation to constantly changing circumstances. She understood persistence, predation better than any other human commander, and she had designed this operation specifically to exploit Veltar assumptions about how civilized species conducted warfare. The ship's hull groaned and twisted as another series of explosions sent shock waves through the Veltar command vessel. Emergency klaxons wailed through the corridors while crew members shouted orders in their harsh native language. Zixandra could feel her ship dying around her, its sophisticated systems failing one by one as the human trap achieved its devastating purpose. Jake stood up slowly as the cell door's magnetic locks failed along with the main power grid. The emergency lighting cast his features in red shadows that made him look like something from Veltar nightmares rather than the helpless prisoner Zixandra had thought she was interrogating. His voice remained steady and conversational, despite the chaos surrounding them. He told her that she had asked the wrong question during their entire conversation. She had wanted to know what made humans think they were special compared to all the other species that had fallen to the Veltar Empire. The real question she should have been asking was what made the Veltar think they were safe from the same fate that had befallen every other predator species that had underestimated persistence hunters. Zixandra found herself backing against the cell wall as Jake stepped into the corridor, though she was not consciously aware of retreating from him. Something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them, and her predatory instincts were now screaming that she was no longer the hunter in this situation. The human moved with quiet confidence through the damaged ship, as if he belonged there more than she did. Jake explained that the Veltar Empire had made the classic mistake of apex predators throughout evolutionary history. They had become so accustomed to easy victories over weaker prey that they had lost the ability to recognize when they encountered something genuinely dangerous. Their success against other species had created overconfidence that blinded them to the unique threats posed by persistence predators. The alien commander tried to restore some sense of authority by pointing out that Jake was still trapped aboard her ship with no weapons and no way to escape. Even if the human attack had damaged the Veltar fleet, he would die when the ship's hull finally gave way under the continuing bombardment. His mission might have been successful, but it was still a suicide operation that would cost him his life. Jake acknowledged that she was probably correct about his chances of survival, but he pointed out that she had missed the most important aspect of his explanation about human psychology. Persistence predators were not motivated by personal survival, but by the survival of their pack or tribe. Individual death was acceptable as long as it served the larger purpose of protecting what mattered most to them. He told her that every piece of information he had gathered during his captivity was already being transmitted to human forces through hidden communication devices that his team had placed throughout the asteroid field. Even if he died in the next few minutes, his sacrifice would provide human military planners with detailed intelligence about Veltar ships, weapons, and tactical doctrine that would be invaluable in future engagements. Zixandra realized that she was witnessing something that no other Veltar commander had ever seen and survived to report. She was watching a persistence predator in its natural element, calmly executing a complex plan that required the hunter to sacrifice itself for the success of the hunt. It was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, like observing the feeding behavior of some exotic and deadly creature. Jake began moving through the damaged ship with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been studying its layout during his captivity. He helped injured Veltar crew members reach emergency stations and showed them how to activate backup life support systems that their panic had made them forget. His actions demonstrated another aspect of human psychology that Zixandra found deeply disturbing. The alien commander asked him why he was helping his enemies when he had just orchestrated an attack that was killing hundreds of her people. Jake's response illustrated the complexity of human moral reasoning in ways that challenged Veltar assumptions about the nature of intelligent behavior. He told her that the Veltar soldiers were not his enemies, but tools being used by leaders who had made poor strategic decisions. Jake explained that humans made distinctions between different types of opponents based on their level of responsibility for aggressive actions. The individual Veltar crew members were following orders and trying to survive, just as he was following his own orders and trying to survive. The real enemies were the commanders and political leaders who had chosen to wage wars of conquest against peaceful species. This moral complexity was something that Zixandra's predator mindset struggled to comprehend. In Veltar culture, enemies were enemies regardless of their individual circumstances or level of choice in the conflict. The idea that humans could simultaneously attack a military force while showing compassion for individual soldiers within that force suggested a type of intelligence that was both highly sophisticated and potentially very dangerous. Jake reached a damaged section of the ship's hull where several Veltar crew members were trapped beneath collapsed bulkheads. He began using emergency cutting tools to free them, working with the same calm efficiency that had characterized all of his actions since leaving the detention cell. Zixandra found herself helping him, despite her confusion about his motives and methods. As they worked together to rescue the trapped aliens, Jake continued his patient explanation of human strategic thinking. He told her that the attack on her fleet was not intended to achieve total victory in a single engagement. Human planners understood that the Veltar Empire was too large and powerful to be defeated quickly through conventional military means. The real purpose of this operation was to demonstrate that conquering humanity would be far more expensive and dangerous than the Veltar leadership had calculated. Every ship damaged or destroyed in this battle represented resources that could not be used against other targets. Every casualty suffered here was a soldier who would not be available for future operations. Jake explained that humans had studied the economic and logistical foundations that supported Veltar expansion throughout the galaxy. Like all successful predator species, the Veltar Empire depended on conquest being profitable and efficient. If humans could make each victory costly enough, they could eventually force the aliens to seek easier prey elsewhere. Zixandra realized that she was receiving a masterclass in strategic thinking from a species that she had dismissed as primitive and helpless. The human understanding of persistence predation extended far beyond individual psychology to encompass economic warfare, logistical disruption, and political manipulation on a galactic scale. This was not the desperate last stand of a doomed species, but the opening move in a carefully planned campaign. The rescue operation was completed successfully, with all of the trapped Veltar crew members extracted alive despite their serious injuries. Jake organized the survivors into groups and directed them toward functional emergency pods, showing the same leadership qualities that had probably made him valuable to his own military organization. His actions were saving alien lives even as his people continued their attack on the Veltar fleet. As they reached the pod bay, Zixandra asked Jake the question that had been haunting her since their conversation began. She wanted to know what would happen to her and her people if they survived this battle and returned to report their experiences to the Veltar High Command. Would the humans hunt them down and execute them as war criminals, or would they be treated as prisoners according to some alien code of military honor? Jake's answer encapsulated everything that made humans simultaneously admirable and terrifying as opponents. He told her that the treatment of Veltar survivors would depend entirely on their future actions and choices. Those who continued to participate in wars of conquest against peaceful species would be hunted down with the same relentless persistence that humans brought to all of their serious endeavors. But those who chose to return to their home worlds and advocate for peaceful coexistence would find that humans could be generous allies as well as implacable enemies. Persistence predators were motivated by protection rather than aggression, and they had no interest in unnecessary killing once the threat to their pack had been neutralized. Jake helped Zixandra into one of the emergency pods and activated its launch sequence as the ship continued to die around them. His final words to her were delivered with the same quiet certainty that had characterized their entire conversation. He told her that she now understood why humans were not afraid of the Veltar Empire, and why the Veltar Empire should be very afraid of them. As her pod ejected into space, Zixandra watched through the small viewport as Jake returned to the dying ship rather than taking another pod for himself. True to his explanation of human psychology, he was choosing certain death to ensure that his mission was completed successfully. She finally understood that she had never been interrogating a prisoner, but receiving a lesson from a predator who had already decided that her education was worth his life.